part 3 of a little teaching on the act of will in honor of Hanukkah. So as I said earlier, when we think about the idea of lighting the inner light, and I drilled that down to the inner life, and this is something that every person here, I think, can see the struggle, and that is when you figure out what you really need to be doing, when you look at the things in your way, when you start to be really tuned into the resistance. Stephen Pressfield says the resistance is now terrified. One thing I think about Stephen Pressfield is everywhere he goes, he creates havoc with the resistance. When Stephen's work shows up, the resistance starts to crumble and it starts to run, reorganize itself, and come back in a new form. What is it that fights resistance? So, meaning when we talk about fighting resistance, who is that? So I want to share with you, this is a book I discovered back in the late 1990s, and it has shaped probably every area of my spiritual psychology, but I want to just go to one page in particular. So he looks at all the different elements of the inner life, and he says the following, quoting from the Hindu tradition, Sarvan Annam, everything is food. We feed not only on physical food, but all sound and visual vibrations, on all kinds of impressions, architectural proportions, union of forms and colors, harmonies and rhythms, music, and all the ideas with which you come into contact. All this, absorbed mechanically, and I would say unconsciously, without real attention throughout the day, makes up our being and continues to do so, unless we decide to apply the will. So he says, we can also learn to use these influences skillfully to build in ourselves what we choose to have. For their dynamics are regulated by laws as definite as those governing physical energies. So I call those our inner habits. The inner habits marshal up an unconscious will. They take everything from the outside world, everything from the inner world, and they bring up our emotional, psychological thoughts, feelings, and producing our words and our deeds. All this happens in general without our conscious will. So resistance plays in that realm. Resistance can fill our habits. Some things we do well, some things we don't do well. Some things we pay attention to, some things by habit we don't pay attention to. But what Assagioli teaches is we can actually marshal up this very mysterious thing called the will, and he addresses that mystery in this book. And I'll tell you why it's so mysterious. See, we can say, I will get up in time, I will exercise, I will do the things I need to do, I will stay on my program, I will stay on my regimen, say, I will it. And then you find resistance, and then something in you gives into the resistance. And then the next day you say to yourself, I won't give in to the resistance. I will conquer the resistance. So that's another I. You might say the I that is beyond the resistance, applying this mysterious thing called the will. And then there's the mystery. What willed that new I into being? And the more you regress into step 1 of the I conquered by resistance, the step 2 of the I, which means I am fighting resistance, the step 3 of the I that is managing the fight with resistance. So he says the various psychological functions can interpenetrate and interact, but the will is in the position to direct this interpenetration and interaction. The centrality of the will allows its supremacy through its regulating power. But this power is in turn governed by psychological laws. Ignoring these psychological laws means to waste or to risk misusing the inherent power of the will. So knowledge of these laws that he's going to outline and the use of the techniques based on them is of fundamental importance. Goes on to say, I will enumerate here those which have a practical bearing on the use of the will, which means the use of the will to govern what he calls the plastic unconscious. I call it the unconscious ego self. Plastic meaning is moldable. When you start working on resistance, it feels fixed. But when you learn the skills that he uses and apply it to the what I call the unconscious ego self, what he calls the plastic unconscious, we can go down in and actually restructure the inner life. And in this chapter of the book, called The Skillful Will, Psychological Laws, he says that is the will, as it were, applied to the plastic unconscious, and we can reshape it according to a vision. And the vision here is the good will. We have the strong will, which gives out. The skillful will, which is what he teaches, rooted in the good will, and then ultimately in love and transpersonal will. And Gene, it's so interesting that you sang that song tonight, because part of what all this is rooted on for Assagioli, as I try to say, ultimately it's about love. Love of self, love of other human beings, love of God, being right with the self, right with others, and right with God. And the question is, where do we fail in those moments, and how can we thrive in achieving that being right with the self, with others, and with God? By the way, I learned that phrase from Gene Miller. Soon after we met, we talked, we were discussing, and Gene said something to me. Gene, I think I'm quoting you. He said, it's all about getting right with yourself, right with others, and right with God. I said, that's so beautiful. I'm going to repeat that the rest of my life. So, Gene, I don't think I ever used that phrase before you and I spoke, so I want to thank you for that right now. Assagioli says, I believe that knowing these laws and some of their practical applications, which we'll discuss in the next chapter, so this is the chapter on psychological laws, the next chapter is the use of them, provides a firm basis for anyone who would train his will to act skillfully. This is the first time I saw the idea you have to train. If you've taken 1 minute of any of my wisdom work classes, you'll see my saying, it's not about insight. It's not about discovering why you are the way you are. It's training in psychological skills to transform the plastic unconscious, that which constitutes our inner life. The reader may want to study these laws once and then return to them. Well, this is my second act of will. The other one is in tatters. I was going to bring it out to show you. I have a few others. I've been reading this book constantly since 1997 when someone introduced the book to me. I'm just going to give you one of the 15 laws of the skillful will, and then tomorrow night I'll give you a few more. And again, why am I bringing this up? Stephen Pressfield discusses resistance. The will is what we use to fight the resistance. So Pressfield here, Assagioli here. Here's the resistance that Pressfield talks about so eloquently in War of Art and other books. Assagioli gives us the actual skills to fight resistance. Here's just one. Law 1. Images or mental pictures and ideas tend to produce the physical conditions and external acts that correspond to them. You have to memorize that a little bit. It sounds mathematical. It has a kind of a physics, a mechanical energy to it. This law has been formulated also in the following way. Every image has in itself a motor element. Whenever we have an image, connected to the image is either repugnance or being repelled or attraction or something else that wants us to do something with the image, even if it creates an emotion. So images don't appear neutrally, images and mental pictures. There's always some motor activity in it, either, again, being repelled, being attracted, or something other quite subtle. But the mental images that we hold typically arrive haphazardly by just our ingesting what's ever out in the environment. We don't manage the mental pictures, or once they arrive in us, we don't manage if they've arrived in us. We don't say to ourselves, well, that's not a good mental picture to have. That's not a good image to carry around with me. Should I produce a different image within that will produce a different, we'll call it motor instinct? Either, again, being repelled properly, being attracted properly, or some other emotion that we, as it were, an emotion that we put into motion. William James was the one to first call attention to the ideomotor action, in which a central idea, now here's we talk about ideas, he'll get to that. He says mental pictures and ideas. So ideas releases, triggers, and gives life to what is happening in the inner life. And he goes on for about another page on that. He has 15 of these psychological laws. I've written them out. I've outlined them. I study them. I haven't taught them because Again, unless you're really interested in the 15 laws of the skillful will, this will put you to sleep. If you've ever wondered what the laws of the skillful will are and how they're applied to the inner life, and you're willing to put a lot of attention into this, this is the book to read. There's nothing like it. Nothing excels this book. Nothing even approximates this book. And one day, there are many people alive today who want to interpret psychosynthesis, want to reteach Assagioli. I've read many of his inheritors. Nobody comes up to him. I have a fantasy, not a will, because I'm not going to give it enough time right now, but I have a fantasy that one day I'll translate Assagioli into the modern idiom, make it much more accessible to the reader today, because we have priceless things in here. So we light the candle tonight in honor of Assagioli, helping us light the candle in the inner life to bring light against the resistance that can darken the balance, darken the harmony in our inner lives.